The date was December 6, 1929. Somewhere in Moscow, a government official signed Decree number 118. The order was simple. All bell ringing in the Soviet state was now forbidden. Every bell in every church, every cathedral, every monastery across the entire nation was to be removed from its tower and melted down. The official reason was industrialization. They needed the bronze. What they actually accomplished was something far more precise. They silenced 1 million voices and eliminated everyone who knew how to make them sing. I found this decree while researching something else entirely. I was trying to understand why old buildings have certain acoustic properties that modern construction can't replicate, why cathedrals make you feel something the moment you step inside, why certain government buildings from the 1700s and 1800s seem to hum with a resonance that newer structures lack. The acoustic research led me to bells. The bells led me to Decree 118, and Decree 118 led me down a path I'm still not sure I should have followed. Before 1917, more than 1 million bronze bells rang across the Russian Empire. Churches, cathedrals, monasteries, civic buildings, these weren't simple instruments. Russian bells were tuned to specific frequencies by specialized craftsmen whose families had passed down the techniques for generations. Over 20 specialized bell foundries operated across the country, each with their own methods, their own secrets, their own acoustic signatures. By the beginning of the 1930s, every single one of those bells had been silenced. The foundries were closed, the craftsmen scattered, and something strange happened to the knowledge itself. It disappeared. When Russia tried to revive bell making after the Soviet collapse, the foundries had to start from scratch. They had to rediscover techniques that had been common knowledge just 60 years earlier. The official explanation is that the knowledge simply wasn't written down, that it was passed orally from master to apprentice, and when the chain broke, the information vanished. But here's what bothers me. The chain didn't break naturally. It was cut. The bell founders didn't die of old age surrounded by students who failed to pay attention. They were removed from the equation entirely during a very specific window of time. I started looking at what else disappeared during that same window. The bells were silenced in 1929. The foundries closed. The craftsmen dispersed. But the bells were just the voice. Who knew how to use them? Who understood the timing, the sequences, the specific patterns that supposedly gave the ringing its purpose? The answer was the clergy. And the clergy were being eliminated at an almost unbelievable rate. In 1917, an estimated 200,000 Orthodox clergy served across the Russian Empire. By 1941, only a few thousand remained. That's not a decline. That's an erasure. Between 1927 and 1940, the number of Orthodox churches dropped from over 29,000 to fewer than 500. Not closed, not repurposed, eliminated. The buildings torn down or converted, the people inside them sent away or simply made to vanish. In 1937, the last monks associated with the Danilov monastery were lined up and permanently removed from the historical record. Their bells had already been sold to Harvard University 7 years earlier. The instruments survived. The people who knew what to do with them did not. Maybe you're thinking this is just anti-religious persecution. The Soviets hated the church. They wanted to erase spiritual life from their new society. That's the standard explanation, and it's not wrong. But it doesn't explain why they went after the knowledge with such precision. They didn't just close churches. They eliminated the people who conducted specific rituals at specific times. They didn't just melt bells. They ensured that no one remained who understood the tuning. They didn't just reject the old ways. They systematically removed every person who could explain what those old ways actually meant. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The Soviet Union wasn't the only place this was happening. Different methods, different justifications, same result. January 10th, 1921. The basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. Late afternoon. A watchman noticed smoke coming through the pipes. By the time firefighters arrived, the damage was already spreading. When they finally extinguished the flames and opened the windows, they discovered that most of the 1890 United States Census had been destroyed. 25% burned completely. 50% of what remained was damaged by water, smoke, and fire. But here's the detail that keeps me coming back to this. The records weren't immediately secured or restored. They were moved to a warehouse and left there for 12 years, exposed to moisture, to mildew, to continued deterioration. And then, on February 21st, 1933, Congress quietly authorized the destruction of whatever was left. Out of the nearly 63 million people enumerated in 1890, only about 6,000 names survive today. That's not a tragedy. That's a precision strike against the historical record. The 1890 census wasn't just any census. It captured America at a critical moment. Mass immigration, westward expansion, the closing of the frontier. It documented who was where, who owned what, who came from where. It was also the first census that didn't require local copies to be filed as backups. Every previous census had duplicates stored in state and county offices. The 1890 census existed only in Washington. When the original burned, there was nothing to fall back on. The investigation into the fire never determined a cause. Maybe it was a carelessly discarded cigarette, maybe faulty wiring, maybe spontaneous combustion of sawdust in the building's workshops. They never figured it out. And nobody seemed particularly concerned about figuring it out. The records were gone. A 20-year gap had been burned into American genealogical history, and the country moved on as if losing the documentation of 63 million people was just one of those things that happens. The more I looked, the more the pattern clarified itself. Think about what was actually lost in that fire. The 1890 census didn't just count heads, it captured unprecedented detail. For the first time, each family received an entire form to itself. Questions about home ownership, immigration status, naturalization, English language proficiency. It documented the precise moment when America transformed from a frontier nation into an industrial power. And all of it, every single detail about 63 million people during one of the most important transitions in American history, reduced to ashes and then deliberately destroyed 12 years later when it could have been restored. Who benefits from that kind of gap in the record? Who needed those 20 years between 1880 and 1900 to remain undocumented? I kept finding similar patterns, not the same methods, not the same governments, but the same target. The people who knew things, the records that proved things, the knowledge that explained things, all of it being eliminated during the same general window of time. In 1937, the same year the last Danilov monks disappeared, two Armenian architects named Gevorg Kochar and Michael Mazmanian were arrested and sent to the polar regions of Russia. Their crime was nationalism and supporting the wrong political faction. But read between the lines of these accusations and you find something else. Architects were being removed for studying the wrong buildings, for asking why certain structures were proportioned the way they were, for noticing that official construction records didn't match what they were actually seeing. The house on the embankment in Moscow became infamous during this period. Over 800 of its residents were taken away. More than 300 of them never came back. Many were engineers, architects, officials who worked with old buildings and old records. People who might have asked inconvenient questions about what they were seeing. And then there are the languages. This is the part that genuinely disturbs me, because it happened in plain sight and nobody connected the dots. Throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, languages were dying at an accelerating rate, not fading slowly over centuries the way languages naturally evolve, dying abruptly when their last speakers passed away, and nobody tried to stop it. In 1906, a man named Ishi passed away in California. He was the last of the Yahi people, the final speaker of his language. Everything his culture knew about the land, the plants, the structures their ancestors built, all of it went silent with him. In 1930, a woman named Ascension Solorzano de Cervantes died in California. With her went the Mutsun language. In 1934, Benjamin Paul died. Chitimacha went with him. That same year, linguists made their final recordings of the Takelma language from two elderly speakers who could barely remember the words themselves. In 1939, the last speaker of Rumsen died in Monterey. In 1940, Delphine Duclos passed, and Chitimacha lost its final voice. By 1935, most of the great Andamanese language family had gone extinct. 10 distinct languages reduced to silence in less than a generation, each one containing words, concepts, knowledge that now exists nowhere on Earth. The standard explanation is that these were indigenous languages pushed aside by dominant colonial tongues: English, Russian, Spanish, French. The old languages couldn't compete, their speakers assimilated, their children learned the new words. Natural linguistic evolution. But look at which languages died fastest. Not random languages scattered across the globe. Place-based languages. Languages spoken by peoples who lived near specific sites, specific structures, specific landscapes. Languages that contained words for concepts that don't exist in modern vocabularies. The competitor in this space, another researcher looking into these questions, found references to a language that contained words like krasnota, the emotional quality of red, zvonost, the singing quality of metal, dukh kamnya, which translates roughly to spirit of stone. These aren't poetic flourishes, these are technical terms. Operational vocabulary for concepts we've lost the ability to even think about because we no longer have the words. Let me show you what I see when I put all of this on a timeline. 1918, bell ringing banned across Russia. 1921, the 1890 census burns. 1922, all gold and silver confiscated from Russian churches. 1929, decree. 1118 orders all bells melted. 1930, the Mutsun language goes extinct. 1933, Congress authorizes destruction of the remaining census records. The same year, the Soviet government establishes quarterly quotas for bell bronze collection. 1934, Chitamaka language extinct. 1935, most great Andamanese languages extinct. 1937, the Danilov monks eliminated. Architects arrested. The house on the embankment begins emptying. 1939, Rumsan language extinct. 1940, 98% of Russian Orthodox churches gone. 1948 and 1949, major purges of the Soviet Academy of Architecture. And in 1952, according to accounts that have surfaced in recent years, the last person who understood how all of these pieces fit together passed away in a city called Almaty, having spent his final hours telling his grandson things he'd been forbid to say for 60 years. I don't think these are coincidences. I don't think these are separate tragedies that happen to align on a calendar. I think this is a pattern. Different governments, different continents, different methods, but the same target. The bell founders who knew the frequencies, the clergy who knew the rituals, the architects who knew the proportions, the census records that proved who was where, the languages that contained words for concepts we can no longer articulate. All of it removed from the world during a 40-year window. All of it targeted with a precision that suggests coordination or at least a shared understanding of what needed to disappear. The buildings are still standing, that's the part that haunts me. Whatever knowledge was encoded in those structures, whatever purpose those proportions actually served, whatever function the bells were meant to perform, the hardware persists. Walk into any government building from the 1800s and feel the acoustics. Notice how sound moves differently than it does in modern construction. Ask yourself why the doorways are scaled the way they are, why the ceilings reach heights that serve no practical purpose, why staircases seem designed for longer strides than any modern human would take. The buildings remember what we've forgotten. They're still configured for operations we no longer understand, maintained by caretakers who have no idea what they're actually maintaining. What if the buildings aren't broken? What if they're just waiting? The frequencies could still resonate if someone knew which notes to play. The proportions still work if someone understood what they were designed for. The machinery is intact. But the operators are gone. The bell founders who could tune the instruments. The clergy who could conduct the sequences. The architects who could read the blueprints correctly. The speakers who could articulate concepts in languages we've allowed to die. One by one, between 1917 and 1952, they were removed from the equation, not through neglect, not through the natural passage of time, through specific, targeted, coordinated elimination. By 1920, no one knew how to tune the bells. By 1934, no one understood the ceremonial sequences. By 1937, no one could read the architectural proportions correctly. By 1940, the languages that encoded operational knowledge were extinct. By 1952, the last person who understood how all the pieces fit together took that knowledge with him. Knowledge didn't disappear because we forgot to pay attention. Knowledge didn't fade because the modern world moved too fast. Knowledge was systematically eliminated. The people who held it were removed. The records that proved it were burned. The words that described it were allowed to die with their final speakers. And we're left standing in buildings we don't understand, surrounded by architecture that doesn't make sense, haunted by proportions that suggest purposes we can no longer imagine. I've spent months trying to find another explanation. Maybe it really was just religious persecution in Russia and bureaucratic incompetence in America and natural linguistic evolution everywhere else. Maybe these events only look coordinated because I'm looking for a pattern. That's what the rational part of my mind keeps saying. But then I look at the dates again. I look at what was eliminated and when. I look at how precisely the knowledge was targeted, not just the objects or the buildings, but the people who understood them. And I can't make the coincidence theory work. There are too many threads. They weave together too tightly. They span too many continents and cultures to be independent accidents. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The evidence persists in the structures themselves. But the people who could explain what any of it means have been gone for almost a century. Not lost, not forgotten, eliminated. And the question I keep asking myself is simple. If someone wanted to erase how the old world actually worked, this is exactly what it would look like. A coordinated 40-year campaign to remove every person who understood, every record that proved, every word that described, leaving the shells intact but the operators gone forever. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The buildings remain, the knowledge does not, and we're supposed to believe that's an accident.